You know when you see those huge, multi-billion-dollar projects go completely off the rails? We always blame the usual suspects, right? Bad management, blown budgets. But what if the real reason is, well, more fundamental? What if it's something literally hidden, right under our feet? So this number, that's the cost overrun for the Hague tram tunnel in the Netherlands. We're talking 90%. 90! For a huge public project, that is an absolute disaster. And hey, this isn't some one-off thing. It points to this massive, systemic blind spot we have when we plan these enormous projects.
And that brings us to the big question, right? It's kind of wild when you think about it. We can land a rover on Mars, a planet millions of miles away. So why can't we build a simple tunnel here on Earth without it getting bogged down, delayed by years, and costing billions more than we thought? The disconnect is it's staggering. So what's the deal? Well, the answer, it turns out, isn't just about bad spreadsheets or messed up schedules. It's about the very ground we're trying to build on. It is fundamentally unpredictable. And this uncertainty, it really breaks down into three different types.
Okay, first up, you've got randomness. Just picture this. You're drilling into the earth. You hit solid rock. Great. But then you move just 1 meter over and suddenly you hit soft, gooey clay. It's like a geological lottery. You just never know what you're going to get. You absolutely can't assume that what you find in one spot is going to be the same just a few feet away.
Next, there's something called fuzziness. And this one's all about language, about how we talk about things. Think about it. What one engineer calls hard rock, another one with a totally different background might call something else entirely. So you get this gap, a gap between what the ground actually is and how we, as humans, describe it. Yeah, take a look at this. It's a classic illusion, right? Which line is longer? Well, you know the trick. They're actually the exact same length. But our brains just can't help but be fooled. Now, if we get this easily tripped up by a couple of simple lines on a screen, just imagine how wrong we can be when we're trying to interpret super complex geological data.
And the last piece of the puzzle is incompleteness. This one's simple. You can never, ever have all the data. I mean, unless you dig up the entire site beforehand, which, kind of defeats the whole purpose of building a tunnel in the first place, you are always working with an incomplete picture, period. So, okay, we've got randomness, fuzziness, and incompleteness. That's a pretty messy cocktail of uncertainty right there. But it gets so much worse. Because now we have to add the single most unpredictable element of all into the mix. People. Human psychology.
And this leads to a pretty brilliant question. Do you play the ostrich game? You know what that is. It's when everybody involved, the clients, the contractors, they just pretend these huge uncertainties don't exist. They stick their heads in the sand because actually admitting how risky things are is hard and it's expensive. So instead, they just roll the dice and hope for the best.
And that gamble gets way worse because of all these classic psychological traps we fall into. First, an expert's opinion is already subjective, right? We've covered that. But then you get them in a room, and one really loud, dominant person can totally skew the whole team's assessment. Or you get groupthink, where nobody wants to rock the boat, so they all just agree, even if it's a bad idea. And what's the result? Teams end up pouring money into managing the wrong risks, all based on fear instead of logic, while the real dangers are just ignored. All right, so that's the problem. It's this messy, complicated mix of unpredictable dirt and even more unpredictable people. But there is a better way. There is a solution. And it's a framework that isn't designed to get rid of uncertainty, because that's impossible, but to actually face it head on and manage it systematically. It's called the GeoQ process, and it's a really clear 6-step cycle. Here's how it works. First, you gather every scrap of information you can find. Then, you proactively identify all the possible risks, and you sort them. You classify them. Now, here's the crucial part. You figure out how you're going to deal with those risks before anyone even starts digging. Finally, you evaluate what's left over, and you pass all of that knowledge on to the next phase. It basically turns a blind gamble into a smart, manageable process. But the real magic here isn't just the process itself. The most powerful part is how you take all those fuzzy, invisible risks and you make them tangible. You make them legally solid, all before a single shovel ever hits the dirt. And the tool that makes this happen is called the Geotechnical Baseline Report, or GBR for short. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like a prenup for the ground. It's a contract you both sign beforehand that lays out exactly who's on the hook for what, no matter what kind of crazy surprises the ground decides to throw at you.
So what is it exactly? Well, a GBR is a contract document, simple as that. It sets up these clear, measurable baselines for what you expect the ground conditions to be. The key is, it doesn't pretend to know everything. Instead, it just defines the thresholds. It takes a fuzzy argument over whether the ground is hard enough and turns it into a black and white contractual question.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. You can see how this works in practice. Let's look at that first row there. Everybody agrees up front. The baseline for the clay layer thickness is 5 meters, okay? So if the contractor starts digging and finds it's only 4 meters thick, which is great, easier to work with, they get the benefit. But if they find it's 7 meters thick, well, the client covers that extra cost. See? The risk is shared. It's fair, and it's totally transparent. So look, it's a great theory. Confront the uncertainty, write it down in a contract, share the risk. Sounds good on paper, but does this stuff actually work, like in the real world on a huge, messy, complex project? Well, let's take a look at the Batuwe Railway project. Back in the Netherlands, there was one particular section of this project that had what everyone called the worst ground conditions of the entire route. I mean, we are talking ridiculously soft soil, major stability risks. It was a total recipe for a disaster. It was the perfect test case for this approach.
So what happened? What was the financial result for that one supposedly doomed section? 25 million euros. But here's the kicker. That wasn't a cost overrun. That was a saving. That's right. They came in 25 million euros under budget. By using a smart risk-sharing contract, the team took what should have been a financial black hole and turned it into a massive success.
And this really brings us to this great quote from John Ruskin, which just nails the whole point. The law of economics does not allow to obtain big value for little money. Basically, if you just take the lowest offer and choose to ignore all the risks hiding under the surface, you're just playing yourself. You're going to end up paying for that risk one way or another. The smart move, the only move, is to deal with it and pay to understand it right from the start. Because in the end, the biggest risks we face are rarely technical. They're perceptual. They're all the uncertainties that we just choose not to see. And that leads me to a final question for you. What are the invisible ground conditions that you might be choosing to ignore in your own world, in your own work, or maybe even in your own life?